I now want to talk to you about Simone Martini. And yes, he does have a last name. He is, I guess you could say, the successor to Duccio. I mean, as you can see, their lives certainly overlap. And it's believed that Martini was a pupil of Duccio's. Once again, we don't have his exact birth and death date. We know he was active from 1315 to about 1344. And he was active in Siena, but he also was in Naples and in Avignon, in France. He worked at the French court of, this is Norman French, of Robert of Anjou in Naples. And Naples and southern Italy, and including Sicily, was a kingdom. And it was conquered at one point by the Norman French. And so you have a strong Byzantine tradition in the artwork because it was Byzantine before it was Norman French. And then you have, essentially, you have this, French ruler at the time. Also, and he was in, let me just show you a picture while we're talking about this. So Martini was, for a few years, 1316 to 17, at the court in Naples. Late in his life, he's documented as traveling to the papal court at Avignon in France. Now, this is the period that they sometimes call the Babylonian captivity, when there were a lot of French popes, and so they moved to France. And, of course, there were saints who were imploring the popes to come back to Rome, which eventually they did. But if you wanted to work at the papal court, you had to go to Avignon in France. There does seem to be some French influence. We said a little bit we have some in Duccio. We also have a stronger French influence, perhaps, in Simone Martini. And Stubelbein, in an article from the 1990 Gesta, that's the name of the article, of the journal, he suggests that Martini may have had a trip to France earlier, not just the one at the end of his life, but earlier, which is not documented. But maybe that's where the influence comes from, or French works coming down to Italy, perhaps. Simone Martini also painted a Maesta. I should point out that nobody has a monopoly on a particular subject matter. And all these different artists paint the same subjects, say, over and over again. So he's painting the Virgin and Child in majesty in heaven, surrounded by saints and angels. Now, this is not a tempera painting on panel, and it's not for a church. It's a fresco. And you're looking at detail of it here. I'll show you the whole thing in a moment. And where it is located is in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, in the council chamber where the city council would meet. Palazzo Pubblico, you can see it means public palace, which is the city hall in Siena, and later I'll show you some pictures of it. He had essentially two painting campaigns. One from 1311 to 1317 when he painted it, and then he comes back in the 1320s and adds and paints and changes things. He repaints parts of it. If you're a real specialist in this area, you probably will be trying to figure out which part was from the earlier campaign, which was from the later. I'm actually not going to try to get into that. But I'm just going to show you here the Maesta by Simone Martini. As we said, the Virgin is the patron saint of the city. She's the guardian or the protector for the council of the Sienese Republic. And so it's there is no separation of church and state. The church and state are very much intertwined, and so she is the protector for we would say the city council. This is painted on their wall where they meet, and you can see the influence of Duccio's Maesta. You have, the Virgin Child enthroned. You have rows of saints and angels, and you also see some interesting things. You have these angels that are kneeling on either side of the steps that lead up to the throne of the Virgin. They're holding up offerings, and it's been suggested that those were inspired by the angels doing something different, but in the same position in Giotto's Ognissanti Madonna. There are French Gothic pointed arches you can see the throne. It almost looks like a French Gothic triptych with all these pinnacles and pointed arches. And then over the whole group, there is painted a canopy or a baldachin, which when you have, important people, they might process with a baldachin over them, or they might be enthroned with a baldachin over them. But also, when you have a religious procession, and say you're carrying an image of Mary or of the saints, frequently they will have a baldachin that is carried over them. So it's something that shows their status as royalty and rulers, and as in this case, heavenly royalty. That canopy, of course, unifies the whole painting, the whole group. And it is a sacred device, as well as carrying it over images of the saints. If you were carrying the Eucharist in a procession, there would be a baldachin over it. Now, some of this is a secco, so some of it has not survived as well. Simone Martini was called back to repaint it in 1321. The problem that scholars have to deal with is which was from which campaign. The plus or minus 1315 and the other from 1321. It's been suggested that he was supposed to make it in an even more Gothic style, bring it more up to date in the 1320s, and says that some of the saints are crisper and that they are in outline and that they are painted later. And here we see some details. Another work, which is, if you don't count since what we're looking at has the repainting on it, makes it in the 1320s. But one of the earliest works we have of Simone Martini was done about 1317. So this was done for Robert of Anjou, and it's showing the canonization of St. Louis of Toulouse. Now, Louis of Toulouse, as you can see, was a bishop, and he was canonized, and he was the brother of Robert, so he's the brother of the King of Naples. He was canonized in 1317, so we believe that this was commissioned at the same time in honor of the saintly brother. We know that around 1316 to 17, Simone was in Naples, where he's working for the French court of Robert of Anjou. Now, the brother was canonized in 1317, so this gives us a terminus, a date that it can't be before, and probably was right about the same time to commemorate the canonization. Now, this is kind of interesting because you have a very traditional format. There's some very conservative elements in this, undoubtedly related to the idea of, heavenly, saintly, even though it's a real person. And you might want to compare this to Berlinghieri's St. Francis. We do have a golden background. We have the saint very large, and then his brother, who's only a king, is kneeling and adoring him, kneeling before him. So really they're saying, the saint is more important than the king.
which is not how old kings felt, but in this case, we do see this. So it's very hierarchical in the size. You have a large saint who is shown very frontally. He's this image, and then the king is very small. He's off to the side. It's a static composition. Nobody's getting up and doing anything particular except kneeling and praying. The saint is holding a crown over the king. So he's conferring the fact that Robert should be the king. He's got an inn in heaven. And one of the ways that Simone Martini enlivens this is all of these curving forms. You see the garment of the mantle of the bishop saint, how it wraps into curves and comes around, and reminded of the meandering arabesque of the hems of Duccio. Only here it's a wide band. So you have a static composition, but enlivened with linear and decorative surface elements, graceful swinging curves, the patterns on the garments, and these crisp linear contours. Simone Martini also worked in a chapel in the Church of San Francesco in Assisi. The chapel is in the lower church, and it is dedicated to Saint Martin. So it's the Saint Martin Chapel. Martin was an early Christian martyr. He was a Roman soldier who converted to Christianity and then refused to fight. And he becomes a bishop. The Bishop of Tours, and fights heresy, things like this. We're just going to look at two of the scenes. These are all in frescoes. There's rows of scenes going up the walls, but I'm showing you two of them that I think are particularly interesting because they're showing this interior space, this depth. With the love of setting that we talk about with the Sienese artists. The one on the left is the vision of Saint Martin. The saint is sleeping. You see this halo identifying him as a saint. And as he's sleeping, he has a vision or a dream of Christ appearing to him. And so we're seeing this space cell or little room, and you can mark the space. There is a chest, the trunk, right close to the viewer. And this could be where Martin keeps his stuff. It could also be a step up to get into the bed. You'll notice that the bed has this wonderful checkerboard pattern, as it were, with more colors than a checkerboard, of course. But, it seems to go up the side and then move over and go across Martin. So it's really taking your eye back in space. It's looking like a solid form. And then Christ and the angels are behind Martin, existing in this room, which you can see the ceiling. Another example of showing you a kind of interior space with a great deal of detail is the funeral of Saint Martin. So you see, parallel to the picture plane, a series of arches. And these little tiny, spindly, but spiral, lots of details there, spiral columns. So they're kept small so you can see the whole scene. But you've got that idea of looking through the columns and seeing what's going on, the funeral of St. Martin. And then, of course, we look past Martin lying on his bier, the people standing behind him, and then we see the walls of the church, or the chapel, which are very much in that French Gothic style, which is now being adopted in Italy as well. Only in Italy, as you can see, they still have more walls. It's not all stained glass. They've got walls with the pointed arches. It's hotter in Italy. You don't want all glass. Some walls to keep it cool.
Okay. You really do have this illusion that you have objects that are behind each other, and that idea of having the colonnettes and the unity of the three windows and the three openings. You have verticals balancing the horizontals of the saint on the bier.
And he breaks up, so it's not just a row of people. He tries to break it up with the figures, leaning over, and the figures singing, and the acolytes in the corner, and people doing different things at the funeral or the burial of the saint. I want you to notice once again, we've got, let's love a pattern. You've got beautiful blue and gold cloth that hangs down, and then the brocade that the saintly bishop is wearing. And then you have figures behind. And you have this is always cute, the monks who are straining for the high notes as they sing, the choir.
I'm also going to show you an altarpiece. This is the Blessed Agostino Nuovo and 4 of his miracles. And this was probably about 1324. It's not dated. I've also seen it dated a bit later to 1330. So 1320s or possibly as late as 1330. In the center, I would like to explain who this person is. He was an Augustinian monk, and he was a beato. In other words, it's the step before you become a saint. You're first declared a beato, which is you're blessed. You're assured of being in heaven. But they need more miracles. And not everybody who people think are saints are actually eventually canonized. And this was a saint that the local people believed that he should be canonized. And they're showing his miracles. That's what you have to have. But evidently he didn't have enough sponsors at a high level, like a king for a brother, to become actually canonized. He was the prior general to the Augustinian order. He's an Augustinian monk or friar. And you might notice that the placement of the figure in the center reminds you perhaps a little bit of Berlinghieri's St. Francis of approximately 100 years before, 1235. But what has happened with the space? Instead of being very frontal and rigid and linear, we have a saint who turns to the side. We have a saint who has some drapery folds, whose face is not just stylized, it's modeled. It could almost, I don't know that it's a portrait, but it could look like a real person. The angel, incidentally, is whispering in his ear, as you can see. And even a bit of setting. We have a ground that goes back, it looks tipped up, and then the edges of trees that make this background space, what we call the negative space, really an interesting space, and frame the saint. And of course you can see you then have on either side 4 scenes from the life of the saint. And in these we're going to see that love of space, as it were. So let's look at an example. In this particular scene, we have 2 scenes where he evidently was known for saving children. So the first one, the one on the left, you see a sort of city, and the wolf has come into the city. He's attacked a child, presumably he's killed him or badly injured him, and they pray to the saint. He's already, or the Beato, he's already died, he's up in heaven. And can you see behind that tower, he's coming out, he's sort of swishing down from heaven, and he's blessing, and he's got the halo, and the child is now sitting up in his mother's lap, restored to health. And then we have the second scene, which I think is even more remarkable because everybody is fitting in this street in an Italian city
which they usually have pretty narrow streets, and where can you go to make your house bigger? You either go up, so they're several stories high, or you might come out a little bit, and you can see that there's some projections to make the house a little bit more spacious. This moves out and are supported here, and of course hangs over the road a bit. And in this case, you see the child 2 times in this little extra space out in front. One of the panels of wood on the wall or the fence has broken off, and the child has tumbled down to certain death, and the mother is crying out as she looks and watches her child. She's crying out to the saint, or the Beato, to save him. And we see on the left, our left, as we look at it, the saint flying down from heaven. You can see he has clouds at his feet to tell us he's coming out of heaven. And he's has a sort of blessing gesture. The child is not going to be hurt, and the board is not going to thump on the kid. He's picking up the board as he flies in. And then we see the child and the passerbys, the child in this brightly striped garment, who look up to the saint in amazement and, of course, happiness because the child is safe and well. Here is another rescue of a child, where the child, to the upper room, the bedroom, the child is in a kind of hammock, and the supports break, and the child is tumbled down, and the mother once again is calling for the aid of the saint, who flies in from heaven and restores the child to life or to health, as the case may be. And then at the bottom you see the mother carrying the child, probably going to the church to thank God and the saint for intervention, and her friends are coming with her. And in all of these cases we're seeing a real interest in setting. Showing what the little city looks like, showing the interior of a house with exterior elements. You see this sort of balcony out on one side. Now this really shows French Gothic elements, and this is before his documented trip to France. But remember, he did go to Naples, where they would probably had some French artwork. The saints standing at the side are attributed to Lippo Memmi. We're not going to talk about those. The center is the Annunciation from 1333. It's now in the Uffizi. It was painted for Siena Cathedral, and the frame itself is a flamboyant French Gothic frame with cuspid arches and gables and just all sorts of decoration. And then you have the Annunciation. Now, the Annunciation is when the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she will bear the Christ child. And you can read about this in Luke, 1st chapter, verse 28 and following. And the angel, looking very elegant, once again with gold brocade, and he has a kind of tartan for his mantle, which is flying around almost like it's a second wing. It's just this wonderful, I'll use the word arabesque again, this wonderful arabesque that cuts up the space and is very, very graceful. And the angel, you can see the angelic words. They're raised up, and the angel is saying to Mary, Ave gratia plena Dominis tecum, which means, Hail, thou who art full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And these words are going from Gabriel, the angel's name, Gabriel's mouth, to Mary's ear. Now, some of the medieval theologians speculated on how did the Holy Spirit get inside Mary, I guess, to impregnate her with the Christ child. And one of the theories was that the word came through the ear. And Christ is known as the Word, and of course a physical word that you're saying. So as though the divine breath of the Holy Spirit breathed in Mary's ear. And so the word, Christ, enters her body. So that may be a reference to that idea. when I did the introduction, I showed you a later painting of Mary actually looking afraid. And here, Mary does look a little taken aback, quite literally. She's pulled back and, sort of recoiling a little. Luke 1:29-30 says, that Mary is troubled at what the angel says, and the angel tells her to fear not. And her words, as we'll see, are returning. She says, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord, eke anceli Dei." And according to Christian theology, this is the moment of the incarnation, the moment when Mary gives her permission. He says, "I'm the handmaid of the Lord." In other words, I'll do what God wants me to do. I'm the servant of God. And this is the moment when Christ enters Mary's womb. So it's the moment of the incarnation when, according to Christian theology, God takes on human flesh, only just, a little speck, I guess we'd say, in the womb of Mary. It's the first sacrifice. And becoming human is a big sacrifice for God. It's the first sacrifice that leads to the ultimate sacrifice of the cross and redeems mankind. And we'll look at some of the details here. When you look at the details, you can see the lovely brocade patterning raised up on the angel's garment, and the tartan, the checked pattern, and the variation of colors in the angel's wings, all against this golden ground. And you can see the words here, and this beautiful silhouette of the Virgin. And here you see the lilies which in this context refer to the purity of the Virgin, Mary's virginity. And this is one last work that I want to show you by Simone Martini. It's in the Louvre. We believe that it was painted between 1340 and 44. So this is a very late work. Remember, we said Simone Martini went to Avignon. He worked at the papal court. He created a Passion polyptych, in other words, a many-paneled altarpiece showing the Passion of Christ, which has been dismantled. And this is one of the scenes from it. It's kind of interesting in a way because some of his other things look so much more French Gothic and elegant. This one, we wonder if he's looked at some German work with some of the extremely emotive things. But of course, Mary Magdalene always is shown as the most emotional figure. You'll see her in the midst of the crowd, wearing red, her hair down, rising up with her hands on either side, just lamenting. And the way of the cross, or Christ carrying the cross, this whole crowd of people is coming through the gateway of, once again, a kind of medieval city. You'll notice that the octagonal dome looks a little like Siena, perhaps. They're coming, and Christ is right here in the foreground, being tormented by these evil people, and he's looking kind of at us, and also his head's turned toward his mother, who is just coming here in the lower left, reaching out, but the nasty, horrible soldier is pushing her back. This motif of the soldiers actually being nasty and harming and preventing the Virgin Mary to get to Christ, it's to intensify the fact that they are really evil people, because the idea of harming the Virgin Mary is just extremely emotive. John is there to help her. He's holding on to her. And you have, even little children throwing rocks at Christ as he carries his cross. Now, you have almost a violent action rather than, the elegance. Well, part of that's just the subject matter. It's also been suggested the influence of other northern elements, even, as I said, maybe German emotionalism or the French late Gothic sculpture, German what we call Vesperbild, Christ dead being held in the lap of Mary. And there's a lot of devotional literature in the late Middle Ages that start to emphasize the suffering of Christ and how the viewer should participate emotionally. So this is supposed to appeal to the viewer emotionally, to think, oh, Christ is suffering, and I need to suffer too. I should have emotional participation. Hart says that this is a revelation to Northern European painters and a crucial role in the development of the new naturalism, which eventually leads to people like Jan van Eyck. However, there is emotionalism in Northern European art and literature before this. So, you have it on both sides of the Alps. In this case, he's in the north. And, Siena is still Jerusalem with its dome of the cathedral.